So I've got this rather enigmatic title. I have to admit it wasn't exactly my title, but I didn't reject it because I thought, I'm just going to talk about what I'm going to talk about. But my starting point is reflections on where we stand. I remember about 30 years ago, I'm sorry, I am going to go back into the past. It's difficult when you're my age not to go back into the past. There's not so much future left and the past looms behind one. But I remember I used to go every year to a school in Wales, a residential school in Wales, and do a presentation on Buddhism. They're mainly overseas students at Atlantic College, quite a well-known place. And I did it successfully for 3 years. It went down very well, I think, and made some good contacts. One even became an order member eventually. But at one point, the leadership, the person who was making the arrangement for me to come, changed. So somebody new was making the arrangement. So at the end of my last session, he said to me, "Thank you very much, but can you direct me to a real Buddhist?" And he said it without a trace of irony or apology or anything like that. "Can you direct me to a real Buddhist?" I was so taken aback, I forgot even to be indignant. So clearly he was thinking, as most people do, they think of Buddhism as a monastic religion. And you think of, if you come to a Buddhist center, people in robes, bald heads, well, okay, and a sort of monastic atmosphere. But you do not find that when you come here. We don't have monks and nuns, not at least in the traditional sense. So you might think then, well, are we real Buddhists? Well, I'm going to argue that we are, and I'm going to do it by telling you a bit of a story. So tonight is going to be history. Sorry, Surigupta, I know you said I don't do this, but I do. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a background story that explains, at least factually, where we are now. And then over the next 2 days, maybe a bit tonight and the next 2 days, I'm going to go into the principles of what we do in this respect. So yes, we usually think of Buddhism as a monastic religion, and with a laity and monks, and to frankly a lesser extent nuns. There are nuns, but they're usually given a lower status. In fact, in a large area of the Buddhist world, the monastic ordination for women died out because of traditional status, etc. But yes, you usually think of Buddhism as being connected with monasticism. Our own teacher was himself a monk in India for many years, lived in a monastery, he founded a monastery and lived there, but he became increasingly critical of traditional monasticism from a number of different points of view. First of all, he became critical of it because it became increasingly formalistic. I'll give you an example from my recent experience. I spent some time in Ladakh in northwest India, where there's still a Buddhist culture, Tibetan Buddhist culture. And I got talking to various abbots and so forth, and they all told me that the numbers of monks and nuns entering the monasteries was going down and down and down. There were fewer and fewer men and women joining the monasteries. So I was quite struck by that. I didn't get a real explanation from them as to why, but later I was talking to the Ladakhi Buddhist hotel owner, and I asked him, what's the explanation for the diminishing numbers of monks and nuns? He said, oh, it's quite easy, birth control. Because what happens in the certainly the Tibetan Buddhist sphere, and I think it's to some extent true all over the world, surplus sons and daughters who cannot be economically supported are given, yes, given to the monasteries. It's not a great hardship. They have a decent life. They get food. They get some sort of activity, get some status. And usually, my experience going to Buddhist monasteries, they're quite fairly happy. But they're not there for the reasons of spiritual commitment. Many of them, of course, there are quite a number who are. But quite a lot are just there because that's where their culture and the economy of their culture has put them. Before birth control, there was no means of dealing with excess population. And particularly in Tibet and Ladakh too, it's very poor living. The soil is very poor. There's not much farming to be had. So you send them, you can't afford new children, so you send them to the monasteries. So that kind of tells you something about the nature of traditional monasticism in the Buddhist world. It's a varied picture. There are places where there are really sincere and dedicated and honest monks and nuns. But much of it, in my limited experience, but certainly directly, but through reading and so forth, is that a lot of it is formalistic. You're just in the monastery because that's where your culture has put you. And you don't have much strong feeling for what you're doing. Yes, you enjoy being there because, you've got lots of friends around you. It's a happy life. But you're not really clear about what you're doing. The president of the Ladakh Monastery Association talked to me about his aspiration. I asked him what he planned to do. He said what he wanted to do was educate the monks and nuns in Buddhism, starting with basic Buddhism. He said most of them have no idea about the basics of Buddhism. So that's a rather grim picture, and as I say, it's much more varied than that. There will be places where there's really live and effective monasticism, but very often it's become formalistic. So formalism has many different aspects to it. One of them is that you have to have gone through a certain set of ceremonies to become a monk or a nun. They can't do it as nuns in the Theravada world because those forms no longer exist. But in the Tibetan Buddhist world, the Mahayana world of the Far East, China and so forth, it still is there. But it's rituals often without much depth of meaning or understanding. Again, I do stress this is not a universal picture. If you meet a monk or a nun, please do not assume that they are merely there because their parents didn't use birth control. That would be embarrassing, to say the least. But yes, you'll find that very often they don't really know what they're doing. Of course, when many of them in the West have come through more personal commitment, but in the Buddhist East, it's a much more varied position. The other aspect that Sangharakshita, our teacher, became dissatisfied with was the tendency to separate monks and laity. And this is especially true of Southeast Asia. The monks, and as I say, there aren't really nuns, there are robed women, but they have a very inferior status, which is largely as sort of servants of the monks. But the monks are seen as sort of almost like little gods, and they require prostration before them. They require feeding. You don't touch them. They have very little sort of direct human contact with lay people. It's different in the Mahayana world. It tends to be more fluid. It's certainly in the Tibetan Buddhist world. Monks and lay people, nuns and lay people mix much more freely. But still there's a sense they're the real Buddhists and lay people are not. They're there largely to support the monks and nuns financially and with food and so forth, and as it were to live their spiritual lives vicariously. Again, I'm giving you a very black and white picture. It's not always like that, and there are notable lay people who are very serious practitioners. But Sangharakshita became very critical of this approach. He also became concerned about institutional celibacy. And we know all about that in the in the modern world because of what's happened with the Catholic Church. To become a priest, my brother's a Catholic priest, you have to be celibate. At least you should be celibate. But if you're suppressing sexual desire, if you haven't transcended sexual desire, and we're going to talk about that more later, then the sexual urges have to have an outlet. It can be a very innocent one. In Buddhist monasteries in Tibet and Thailand and so forth, there's a lot of homosexuality. No problem, but can't we just say it's happening? There's sort of a hypocritical assumption of celibacy when it isn't really there. But when celibacy is enforced, then it often comes out in really destructive ways. So much abuse we've seen in the Catholic Church because of this enforced celibacy. People haven't actually got to the point spiritually where sex is not an issue for them. As I say, we'll talk more about that later because that's in the background of what we're going to be discussing. So, you're very critical of this tendency to identify serious practice with a celibacy that was not felt, if you see what I mean. A celibacy or chastity that you did because that's what you had to do if you became a monk or nun. And, well, you don't have to do that in order to make spiritual progress. Again, we'll talk more about that later. So, yes, he was quite concerned, critical about that. He also considered that monasticism in Buddhism, certainly in India and then in other countries too, had grown up under very different socio-economic conditions. And grown up in essentially feudal societies, pre-modern societies, traditional societies, in which there really was no alternative. Either you married and entered family life, had a social role, or you went forth into the jungle and lived a celibate and a serious Dhamma commitment. So that arose because of the conditions that existed in India in the 2,500 years ago. There was an established practice in India at that time that you could leave the family and, as it were, separate yourself from conventional society and live a serious spiritual life, spiritual quest. It's not just Buddhism. Indeed, even today, you still see sadhus wandering around. Some of them are pretty questionable, but at least some of them are serious practitioners. So the idea grew up that if you fed these wanderers, these people who'd left civil society, you got some sort of spiritual merit. So there was a sort of a merit economy. I give you food. By giving you food, I get some benefit. Of course, it's not entirely untrue. But because it became increasingly formalistic, it became increasingly empty. And, I've seen myself monks in India who are not supposed to eat after the sun is at its height, its zenith, eating later in the day but making sure lay people can't see them. So you get that sort of formalism that goes with it all. So Sangharakshita said, let's start again. We have completely different kind of society, which is much more flexible, certainly in Britain in the 1960s and in much of the Western world, whatever that means, became much more flexible. Many more variations of family life. Of course, people could divorce, leave their families and so forth, or split from each other. There was possibility of sex outside of marriage, which in many traditional societies is absolutely frowned upon. I work in India, and I know it's a very serious issue there, and people can be killed for that. So many traditional societies enforce, as it were, the integrity of the culture by having strict barriers on who can have sex with whom. But it doesn't exist like that in the West anymore. And Sangharakshita arrived back in the West in 1964. Anybody know there, Philip Larkin? Sex was invented in 1964. Alas, too late for me, he said, although it turns out later it wasn't. But it was that the sexual revolution took place. So he came back to Britain. He'd left in 1944, which was still a basically traditional culture, but divorce was still very much frowned upon, and sex outside marriage was still scandalous, certainly amongst the middle classes. So he came back to a very different Britain, much more wealthy, much greater economic possibility. You could easily move from job to job. People of my father's generation got in a job, stayed it till they died. But that all broke down in the 1960s, 70s, and my goodness, the 80s, thanks to Mrs. Thatcher's handbag. It's a very, very different Britain, and one that was much more open. Christianity was clearly, much diminished. Even I remember growing up in the 1950s, going to the village church. Everybody in the village was there. But 20 years later, my mum and dad were the only ones, and the vicar. It just rapidly, the Christian basis, at least for the white traditional British population, died down. There's huge openness to the East. The Beatles had come along and learned from, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And people of my generation were really sort of suddenly awakened to the opportunities of the East. So Sangharakshita came in on the back of this massive change in society, and he decided, first of all, that he would form an order, but not an order that was based on monk and lay. That was simply based on spiritual commitment. The full meaning of this didn't come till a little bit later, but fairly quickly he concluded that an order of seriously committed individuals did not have to be either lay or monastic. In fact, he says our order is neither lay nor monastic. You can't put us in one of those traditional boxes from the Buddhist East. It's neither lay nor monastic. And he ordained people who were, like me, at the age of 25, unmarried, not thinking of marriage. And at the same time, he ordained people with families. And he anticipated that there would be a serious engagement from every order member, regardless of their lifestyle, so long as their lifestyle supported their efforts. So he attracted a load of young hippies. I don't know whether any of you read your history books and know what hippies are. Believe it or not, my hair was somewhere down here in those days because I had some. Mostly, had explored quite a bit of psychedelic experience and were very much into something radical and new and exploratory. So Sangharakshita found himself with a bunch of young people who were not at all interested in conventional life, were increasingly deeply interested in the Dhamma, increasingly interested in a serious spiritual life. And at that time, communities were in the wind. There were quite a number of communities being formed in the 50s and 60s, intentional communities. And so some people began to live in community, and they were mainly mixed communities, men and women together. Then we opened a centre in an area of North London near Highgate Cemetery, within a stone's throw of Marx's tomb, where the local council, I didn't wish to throw a stone, by the way, but the local council, Camden Council, had decided to redevelop it, a huge area, a square mile or more. So they emptied all the traditional population out of these Victorian terraced houses, and then ran out of money and left them empty. So at that time, it was legal to squat a building. That's the technical term for it. A later Conservative government made this illegal, but it was a common law right that if a building was empty and you were not caught breaking and entering, you had the right to remain in there until proceedings were taken to remove you. So suddenly we had 8 or 10 communities. The rent was extremely low, and some of them were mixed communities. I moved into a community of men and women. I'll give you a piece of advice: never move into a community with the girlfriend you are breaking up with. This is a piece of wisdom that probably most people would have thought of before. I think it's one of the most painful experiences of my life. Yes, we had suddenly a number of communities. One of these communities, it happened that the people who broke in happened all to be men. 5 young men broke into a house, and there were 5 rooms, blow me down. So they moved into those rooms. So there was, without premeditation, a men's community. They loved it. They loved it. They found that something happened when just men together, and I don't mean like a beer party or something like that, but you just relax. You just relax. And so a group of women broke in next door and set up a community, and they found something similar, that it really worked. You didn't have to worry about, how manly you were or how attractive you were. You just relaxed. We were young as well, don't forget, so this was all right to the fore. And this really was the beginning of an exploration, an experiment. At some point, the council decided that they were going to develop, and they chose to pull down our centre, which was in an old piano factory that the council had vacated and that we took over. Legally, we had a lease for that. Anyway, they asked us to move, so we started a search for a new centre. Here it is. And as you heard, it wasn't literally burnt out. There had been a fire in it, but the roof was intact, fortunately. And so we formed a team of men. There were, at one point, 30 of us living in the building and working on the place. Simultaneously, a group of women formed a community nearby, and then eventually set up, with Bante's encouragement, Sangharakshita's encouragement, a retreat centre in North Wales, Taraloka, which they did with their own hands. And so we had this experience of not just living together, but working together. And we found, I was here throughout that project, we found that a very, very special atmosphere developed amongst us. We were young, so it wasn't always a pleasant atmosphere. There was plenty of fighting, not fisticuffs, of course, but people who couldn't face each other and that sort of thing. And of course, fallings out over the most important thing, washing up. In communities, when there's a disagreement, it's usually not about fundamental principles or anything like that. It's about washing up, because different people have different ideas about how you should wash up. So we experienced the extraordinary effect of living and working together. The very powerful accentuation of our spiritual aspiration. We were meditating together every morning, right up in the top of the building here, while this was still a burnt-out engine shed. 2 fire engines stood here. In communication with each other, studying together. It was really mostly, for me at least, a remarkable experience, a very, very satisfying one, and working for something you really believed in. It's the most wonderful thing you can do is work for something you believe in. I think so often people are half-hearted in their work. They don't really believe in it, or only do it to climb the ladder, as it were, or for money. But if you can love what you have to do as work, it's, I think, one of life's greatest blessings. So towards the end of the project, Sangharakshita asked me to come and see him, and he said, look, you've got these 30 people living here in this building, and there's a women's community around the corner who were also doing things like they made these hangings, and they did a lot of the work in the final phases. What are you going to do with people? They've had this experience of living and working together. What are you going to do when it ends? So he asked me to encourage the setting up of right livelihood businesses. It started with a whole food shop and went on to a cafe, where now the Mandala Cafe is. We started an illicit cafe behind corrugated iron doors. I don't know what the health inspector would have said. But then that was done up properly and became the Cherry Orchard, and later the Cherry. And then it went out of our use, but it's come back again, I'm very glad to say. So we had a number of businesses around here which gave people a means of livelihood. It meant that they could make their work into a spiritual practice, part of their meditation. What Sangharakshita says somewhere, if your work is not your meditation, then your meditation is not your meditation. Think about it. It's quite challenging. I won't say it was always easy, and of course many people were very new to Buddhism, but we gradually developed what we termed a semi-monastic lifestyle. A semi-monastic lifestyle in which we lived together in communities, most of which were men or women, some were mixed. We worked together in businesses that gave us a livelihood, a minimal livelihood because we lived very cheaply, and also raised money for the centre. So a lot of the work that you'll see that's been done on the centre here was done through this, through work done in the right livelihood businesses here. And we had a big business, I think it was employing 150 people in Cambridge, which supplied a lot of money for other activities too. So, we were making money to fund the spread of the Dhamma. And this semi-monastic lifestyle that began to form was, as it were, the beginnings of an alternative to monasticism. Nobody was vowed to it. There was no celibacy, for instance. Celibacy was not required, although some might have observed celibacy. There was no boundary, as it were. People sort of floated in and out. Some people might be working in the businesses but not living in the communities. Some would live in the communities but not work in the businesses. So that it was a quite flexible core, as it were, to our movement. And I think you'll find when you look at our centres all over the world indeed, that those that are most effective and flourishing, like this one, have that semi-monastic core. There's a core of people who are living and working, or at least living or working together and helping to run the centre. That, I think, is one of the keys to success. The LBC is outstanding in that way. I think we now have 7 communities, something like that. Must be something like that. And we have, of course, the centre itself is run by a team of men and women and run as a right livelihood enterprise and run on ethical grounds, and where friendship is important and where communication is vital, and where we study together what it is that we're doing. So we have, the centre itself is a work situation where people can work together on the basis of the Dhamma. We have the Mandala Cafe, which has just recently opened, and which is again an opportunity for people to work together on the basis of the Dhamma. We have Lama's Pyjamas down the road. Of course, Lama's Pyjamas, if you haven't visited it, do. It sells high-quality second-hand items. I'm not dressed in it, but sometimes I would be. And a very good source for people who are working for relatively low wages so that they can give to the Dhamma. So we have 3 businesses around here, at least. Do we have more? Not at the moment. Not till... Huh? Jambala. I'm very sorry. There's a bookshop next to the cafe. Anything else I've missed? But there should be more. There should be more. There should be the opportunity for more and more people to live and work together on the basis of the Dhamma. Some will be there just trying it out, and there's a bit of a turnover. Some will be there long term. There are guys living upstairs who've been in communities all their lives, as it were, for 40 or 50 years, maybe. As one of the wonderful things about these communities, you'll get a whole range of generations living together, which is something very unusual. I read recently that intergenerational friendship is dying, that the generations are increasingly isolated from each other. But in one of the women's communities around there's a couple of women who are in their late 70s, and then there are people quite young, younger than Ruth even. But yes, so there's a spread of ages, and that means there's a sort of a sharing of experience, and of course an enlivening of those who are older. There's nothing better for those who are old, I speak from personal experience, than contact with the young, meaningful contact, friendly contact. So we've built an inner world. It's not, as I say, boundaried. It's not impermeable, and people do float in and out. I've floated in and out myself of different communities at various times. And it's not that you're committed for life, but there's the possibility that you could be. You could, if you find it suitable to you, live in this environment for the rest of your life, as some people are doing, some quite close to death even. So this semi-monastic core is, as it were, an alternative to the sometimes rigid split between monks and laity. It arises out of the situation that we find ourselves in this modern world. Of course, all of you are participating to some extent in that semi-monastic world. There was a very nice introduction to retreats by Kushalasara in the interval. And a retreat is really a semi-monastic situation. Might even say monastic, although nobody takes vows. But you're living together, you're working together, you do the cooking and the washing up, you do some work in the gardens or whatever, and you're meditating together and you're communicating together. So it's really the experience of retreat that was the archetype for this formation of these semi-monastic situations that are so much part of Triratna's offering. We offer the possibility to those who want it of getting inside this much more intensive environment. Of course, the environment doesn't do it. Just having that environment isn't enough. You have to work. You have to commit yourself. We have to commit ourselves, whatever our circumstances. We've got a family. We have to commit ourselves to the Dhamma within the family situation. But obviously, in the semi-monastic setting, you've got much less weighing upon you. You may take responsibilities for the development of the Dhamma, but you don't have, as it were, conventional responsibilities. So you have the opportunity to apply yourself much more directly and clearly. Doesn't mean that people not living in that situation may not make more progress. It's up to them, it's up to the individuals. But if you take advantage of the advantageous circumstances, they will support you. So when you come to the centre, you are a participant in that semi-monastic situation. There are people here in the room who are living in the communities, people who are working in the businesses. There are people who've lived in the communities in the past. So it sustains the atmosphere that we have had that extent of interaction with each other. I was recently in a situation where I was with a lot of old friends. I've been ordained for half a century. I can't believe it. I was ordained when I was 1. I'm not fooling anybody, but I've known people in communities, in working situations, throughout those 50 years, and the depth and extent of connection between us is extraordinary. It's as if we don't have to speak sometimes. Just being together is enough. Just to be together. You don't have to do all that catchy-uppy sort of stuff. You're just with each other, and the years drop away, you might say, because of the depth of connection that we made when we were living and working together. So, I'll draw to a close, but what I've tried to communicate is that we don't do the traditional monk, nun, lay split. We don't do that. Our ordination is not a monastic ordination. Some people in the order will be living more intensive lives, pretty much like monks, I suppose, or nuns, and some will be in families, and some will be in all sorts of other states and conditions. The one thing that unites us is our commitment to following the path of the Dhamma, the teaching of the Buddha, until we come nearer and nearer to the state of enlightenment that the Buddha himself experienced. And we do it in company with the Sangha, those who are similarly committed. But some of us live together, work together for the sake of the Dhamma in these more intensive environments which we call semi-monastic. And they have an important part in the total economy of our movement. I believe that the LBC, of course I'm the president of the LBC, so I would say this, I believe it's probably our most active and effective centre. Oh dear, this is going out to the world. But I've visited quite a few. And one of the things I really notice is where centres are effective, there's at least a community. There's at least some sort of business. So that there's some kind of intensity at the heart of it. This is almost universal. You can't ever be absolute about these things. So I hope I've kind of given you a picture of how it formed. It formed organically. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a scheme. Sangharakshita, I once asked him, did you think it all through in advance? He said, I never plan. He just responds to the situation in front of him. He just responded to the young men and women in front of him and followed their inclination, their direction. And from that formed something that I think is very, very valuable. So over the next 2 nights, I'm going to talk more about the key features of this, of what it is that really makes up monasticism in its broadest sense in Buddhism, and therefore what semi-monasticism means. And this is not going to be relevant only to those trying to live that life. It's going to be relevant to everybody who wants to live a Buddhist life. Even if you can't or don't want to live and work in this semi-monastic setting, you yourself need to be putting these factors into play. Otherwise, progress is very difficult because one is so much bound up with the world. One is so much embedded in conventional society. One is so much embedded in me and doing things for self. So I'm going to try to give you a picture of what that might mean for you. But I hope you have at least appreciated something of what goes on at this centre and a possibility that you might take advantage of. If you can't take advantage of it now, you might at some point in the future. There's never a point at which you can't enter a community or join a business, right livelihood business. although we do need more of them so you can join them. And we need people to start them so people can join. So yes, this is something going on in the background of the LBC when you come here that you may not be so aware of. The two men's communities upstairs, there's a women's community just the other side of the courtyard. There are three women's communities round the corner on the way to Victoria Park, and there are various other communities here and there. And yes, you can be aware of the businesses. So please take note that there is the possibility for you, if you want it, of a deeper engagement. And yes, we'll talk more tomorrow night about the key ingredients of monasticism in the broadest sense, not in the technical sense. And those 5 aspects are, first of all, celibacy. You're all looking scared and you won't come back tomorrow. But don't worry, it's not as bad as it seems. Then fewness of possessions, living a simple life, not making your career into your only means of aspiration, making sure that your aspiration is for the Dhamma. And finally, community living as much as you can in community. So we'll explore those 5 aspects. As I say, they apply most directly to those living in the semi-monastic situation, but every one of us should be working along these lines. And I'll explain much more fully, but please do come back. It's not as bad as it sounds. And I hope that all will be clear and you'll be thoroughly excited and want to live in a community and join a right livelihood business.